So if you're new to Next.js and you've never used it before, or you need a refresher on how Next.js works, in this section we'll be just going over the basics so that you're prepared for making this chat application. But if you already know the basics and you know how Next.js works, feel free to move on to the next section. So firstly, why do we need Next.js? Well, if you've ever built a React application that was full stack, you know that we need a bunch of different dependencies and libraries to make it. So if you use the MERN stack, we know we need to build an Express server in the backend, and then even at the front end, we need stuff like React Router to enable routing in our entire application. And it's just a bunch of stuff that you need to install and set up. And it basically combines everything that you need to build a full app from the front to the back. So routing is built into Next.js, and you can also create the entire backend through Next.js without needing to install something like Express.js. So just to summarize, Next.js just makes React full stack development a lot easier. So now that we know that, let's just take a look at the different folders that were generated by Next.js for us when we ran that command. So we'll ignore the components and the lib folder because we made that when installing Shadcn and creating the lib for the utils. But the two main folders that we care about is the app folder and the public folder. So the public folder is pretty simple. It just contains static assets like images and SVGs, which can be used in our application. But the main content of our application is stored inside this app folder over here. This is where all our front-end routes and front-end pages go. And the files here basically tell our application what to render at each URL inside our application. This will make sense later on, but just know that the app folder is where we'll be doing most of our coding. Next, we have some top level files. So firstly, we have the next.config.js or MJS, and this just contains configuration details of how our Next.js project will work. We'll be editing this a bit later on. Package.json you will probably be familiar with if you've ever built a React or Node application, and it contains a list of our dependencies and different commands that we have. We will be creating a middleware.ts file that's mentioned on the right hand side inside the Next.js documentation. And this is just some code that gets run on every page load, and we can do some stuff like checking for authentication and stuff like that so that we can redirect the user if they're not logged in. And the rest of the files, such as the tsconfig and then the post css config, are not important for us to discuss right now. But if you ever want to change any configuration for your CSS or for your TypeScript, you can take a look at these quick files. So the next thing we need to take a look at is the routing convention. So I mentioned that Next.js has routing built into it. It uses something called a file-based routing system. And this basically means that the way you arrange your files and folders inside this app folder defines the different routes in your application. So inside the app folder, you will see something called page.tsx. And what page.tsx does is that it tells Next.js the code to render at a particular URL. So since this page.tsx is right in the app folder, this defines what to render in the home page. So again, if we take a look at our application, we see that we are rendering a button at page.tsx, and the URL is just /. So if we render /, we just see the button which is at page.tsx. Before we expand on this further, we need to take a look at layout.tsx. And what layout.tsx does is that it defines what to render at the current route as well as every sub route. To make this point clearer, let's make a new folder over here and let's just name this user. So we have a folder called user, and then let's create a page.tsx there as well. And let's copy the code we had over here. We can define this anything. We can name this as anything. So let's name this as user. And let's just create an h1 over here and say this is the user page. Now we see we have a folder called /user and we have a page.tsx inside that. So we would expect that when we go to /user, we see that the code that we have over here is rendered out as this is the user page. So we can begin to see that if we had any nested folders and we had page.tsx there as well, we would be able to see that by going to there using the path in our URL. This brings us to the next file type, which is layout.tsx, which is another reserved keyword by Next.js. And what this does is that it basically is used to define a wrapper which is rendered for a given path and for every subpath inside it. So if we went back to the home page, and if over here above children we added some text such as this is being rendered in the layout, we will see it not only rendered in the home page because it is the layout for the home page, but if we go to /user, we will see it being rendered here as well. So again, layout.tsx basically defines what to render at a given path as well as every child path of it. This is especially useful if you're making something such as a navbar or a footer and you want it applied to every child page. And page.tsx and layout.tsx are the main two files that we'll be using throughout our application. So these are the only ones we care about. But you can see that we have a bunch more reserved file types which are rendered in different scenarios, such as the error.tsx, which is rendered whenever there's an error on a page.